one of the things I want to talk about today is how we as user experience people do a lot of focus in terms of the user experience, how to improve it and make it more efficient. Well, one of the ways to make it more efficient is actually to tie it into the back-end systems, because that, as probably a lot of you have experienced as you've gone through a lot of projects and processes, you'll go and create and craft an excellent design, an excellent user experience, and then technology will come in and say, that can't be done, or there are difficulties involved. And it usually involves around two things, data and performance. So if I'll go down into each different route over here, and the first one, data, we'll go into malformed data, inconsistent data, and basically no data at all. So with malformed data, go ahead. Here's an example. So on the current project I'm working on, Marriott, this is the type of data that your web services or your API from the web service will return back. So if you look over here in all the places that are marked in red, this is the data. So in the user experience part of things, the UI, we had tried to break it up into bulleted, readable, scannable instructions. Well, this is the pure data that comes back. It's not delineated, it's nothing. It's a wall of text. So we thought, okay, let's try to break it up at all the periods. Well, that doesn't work very well either, because you can see 0.5 miles, it would cut that off. If you see St. Michael's or Fort Lauderdale, it'll cut those off. So we had issues with trying to break that up and to make it more readable. If you look on the right-hand side where it says address, you look at a lot of address where it says line 1, where there's a lot of places where you have line 1, line 2 for addresses up to line 3. Well, the back-end system truncated and shoved in line 1 and line 2 together into one response over here. And then if you look down here, when you're trying to give a name to a particular room, it might be as simple as Executive Lake View, but the response comes back and gives you all this extra stuff to it. And so you're just trying to show the one thing. So luckily on that one, you can delineate by the comma there and just say, focus on that one, drop everything else. But in your descriptions, you're stuck with all this stuff, and you have no way right now to go about and figure out how to edit it. And a lot of it is just free-form entered in by the actual properties themselves. Go to the next one. So here's inconsistent data. So if you look on the side, which you can't really see very well, unfortunately, is on the English side, this is the response that we get back from the back-end systems. It tells you languages spoken at the property, English, Hindi, and Turkish at this one. If you look at the non-English speaking side, this is what gets returned back, 0. There's nothing that gets returned back. If you look at this part where you're looking at local attractions, local information for a property, you'll get quite a bit of information. On the other side, you get nothing, so you'll be good luck in either trying to design your UI to adapt to no information coming back at times or a lot of information. So your UI has to adapt by the data that's coming back. That's one of the things that we found out. And then if you move the next one, then the no data part. So one of the biggest things that we have is from user research or from us going through and talking to other people and just feedback directly from the client, from the customers themselves, they'll say, we want bigger photos to browse. We want more amenity information. Well, you'll either have the fact where your backend system provides you none of the data because they don't store it, or they store it but they say, we can't give you access to it at this current time. Maybe in a year, maybe in 2 years. But at the moment, your nice, fanciful UI has nothing for you to place it in. So you have to stage all your features, your content into groups for technology before they can be developed. And then what I want to go through next is the performance. So the impact of your design on performance. The impact of business logic on performance, and the impact of the site app when the source systems go down. So a lot of times we don't think too much of this, but especially, this is really important, especially for mobile applications, because the biggest thing that we are so used to on PCs and laptops that are hooked up either through the landlines or even through strong wireless connections, Wi-Fi connections, we have a lot of data that we can download down. But when you're now mobile, you're out there, people are in the airports just trying to go through, we will have issues as we've experienced on here. So if we go to the next slide. So here's an example that we had. So this is a simple one, saved hotels. If you're a member, you can save up to 20 hotels into your account. It's a simple one where you can, once you log in, you can get the photo of the hotel, hotel property name, and the location. Simple, right? 20, easy. Well, in order to create that list right now, using just pure web services, you're calling 3 different web services just to do this one particular list. First, you have to sign in. So sign in is a login web services, and then that you can add on to get their account information. This account information coming back includes all your stuff. So if you're a member, your address, your name, your preferences, your point history, and it includes a list of unique IDs for every property that you saved as a saved hotel. Then you have to call another web service for each and every one of the hotels. Individually, it goes out, and instead of just being as easy as getting the name and the location, it actually has to go and gives you back, and I'll show you in a little bit, all the data about that property. So you might be looking for 3 pieces of information. It returns hundreds of pieces of information. And then the last one is that photo isn't included in all that information. Either call another web service to grab this photo. So out of all this, this is now an expensive payload. So the response that comes back from here is an expensive cost. And if you don't know what quite a payload is, if you imagine you're building a house, right? So building the house, that's what you're doing, and then the time it takes to build the house, that's a page load time. How many trucks delivering all your bricks, that's your payload. So for something like this, we're now delivering multiple trucks coming in to build your house as opposed to one simple truck. So that's with the current web services. So when we found this out, we started working with the API development team to try to streamline this. And one of the things that we came up to is at least include in the API response just the photo, as simple as that. Now we couldn't go and play with, in the first release, saying I only want the property name and the location. They have to shove everything in at the moment. But it's staged now to the point where as we talk to them, the next releases will be able to state that we want only the property name. We only want the address, or we only want amenities. So those type of things that they can't build now in version 1, but they can build in version 2, 3, and 4. So that's one of the things that we helped them in determining and basically staging out in the release cycle. So one of the other impacts happens to be business logic. So this is, as convoluted as this process flow happens to be, this is a simple availability search. So if you're looking for a hotel at Marriott with dates, these are all the decision patterns that have to go through. So there are required fields, there are optional fields, there are scenarios that are based on if you're a member, if you're not a member, if you're using special rates or not, that has to be decided. All this part has to be coded and programmed, and at which point do you decide, does the front end side of the things get developed, or does the back end side of things put all that intelligence in there? And that all affects the actual performance and load time of that particular screen. So it's not just images now, it's also decision points and mapping of that information. If you move to the next slide. So the last one of performance is the impact of when systems go down. So your API is hitting multiple different systems most likely, if you're ever working with that. So you have a system that's specifically for properties, a system that's specifically for your account and for content. So if any one of those goes down, you have to have a friendly way to let them know. Well, unfortunately, we initially did not think that that would occur too much, or we didn't think about that. So our default error is our temporary loss of service for every single thing that we did not catch. So if everything was working fine, but we couldn't hit one particular system, you got a temporary loss of error. And when someone sees that, they're going to assume that, okay, Marriott's down, so I'm not going to hit that particular Marriott app, and I'll close it down and go do something else. Well, we've lost now a stream of possible revenue going through there. The other ones are just really bad error messaging on our side of things. I mean, error code 202, unexpected error, that helps anyone out. The profiles of profile types, that really helps anyone out. So we've improved that, but that's only from learning through sending it out initially and getting all these errors back, because no matter how much testing we could have done, pushing it out to millions of people really showed us all our scenarios that we could have caught. But this was what we found out, and this is what we've improved. So we've now been able to work with the API team to list out a whole list of error codes from every single API request, and then from there we can help map it. And I'll show you a document that we worked on for that next. So for those of you who here knows of API, what application, okay, well that's pretty awesome. So quite a bit of you do. So, I'm going to go through a crash course of understanding the concepts, the terminology, and where we as UX people can fit into this. So Shivani, if you can move to the next one. Oh, this is awesome. So the purpose of an API, so if you think of it, it's an interface that allows a channel to access data or actions upon that data. Now, it's not an actual GUI interface. It's a basic like URL, most likely for most cases. I'll show you a Twitter example later on. And so that URL basically identifies what process you want to do. And there's two main types, two big types. One is called SOAP, and I'll get into it. One's called REST. The other ones that you want to know about are the objects that are associated. Your data are basically a hierarchy of objects. Being UX professionals, you know a taxonomical structure. That's essentially how your data is brought up. So let's go into that object. So if we look at this here, so this is the structure of a member. So each one of those are individual finite pieces of information. A phone number consists of a number field and a description so that you know if it's a home or if it's a business. Address, name, account, all those things. Now all those shove up into what a member actually is. So when you go about and say a member logs in, I want to get account information for that member, you're actually getting all this other information in there. So this is just for you as a member to Marriott. This is what you're getting back when you're doing a request. If you go to the next one, this is what a property happens to look like. So all this information, the name, description, location being the address and the lat long, but also every single possible piece of information that comes out. Now, unfortunately, that means these are hundreds and thousands of lines of data long. So right now, without the ability to just pick and choose what you want responded back, it's an expensive, big payload coming into that you have to go through. So when that comes through, your front-end developer, either on the app side or from the front-end coding side, they have to sift through all that type of stuff. So if you go to the next one, what we're going to go through now is some basic information here. And as you see on the left, which you can't read, the basic functionality of retrieve, create, edit, delete, those are the basic functions that you, as UX and interface designers, go through for creating content. Well, the REST commands, the REST basic type commands are get, post, patch, delete. So those are the basic types of commands that you're trying to, the URL will structure out to. So those are the ones that will tell that system what to do with it. If you want to create a new member, you basically post up all the information for that particular member and it'll create it in the backend systems. SOAP is a little different because SOAP basically does not use those type of commands, but it's a URL structure and a definition set of parameters, and that helps define by that URL what's going to be taken action on. So here's a sample URL. So this is a simple one. This is Twitter's. So what this basic sample does is just looks for one single tweet, just a single tweet, not too complex, right? Pretty simple. If you go to the next page, in order for you to get one little tweet like this sample Yahoo one over there, the Yahoo, the Twitter name, the logo, and the actual tweet itself, this is the full payload response. And all the red dots that oh, you're right, but you can't see some of them. There's like 3 red dots on here. They're small little, but in order to make 3 or 4 pieces of information, you receive all this. So your system, or your front-end system is receiving all this, and they have to filter through and find that 4 pieces over there. So you going through, when you're saying, why is the UX is efficient, but the performance might be slow, a lot of times it's because of stuff like this, where it's coming in and you're returning a lot of information. So if you have access to your developers, when you're working with them, when they're going through performance testing, when you're going through a lot of testing, if they can streamline and simplify, saying, all I want is specific pieces of content, that allows them, when they develop that, so that you can identify the pieces of content, that's all that will be returned, and that streamlines a lot of all this information, extra stuff that does not need to go through at certain points in your experience and certain points in the process. So go to the next slide. So let's go back to the saved hotels. So in this saved hotels, a user can save up to 20 possible hotels with 4 pieces of data. So that's the photo, the property name, the city, and the state. That what's returning back for those properties is 46,000 lines of code. Okay, so that's a huge thing for just that little pretty list over there. It's 46,000 lines of code that your front-end developers have to sift through. So what we had to do was, we couldn't improve 46. We dropped it down to about 30-something lines of code with the inclusion of just the image inside the property return call. When you look at things, it saves me half a second, but in performance testing, but if you look at the larger picture of everything, when you're dealing with slower reception at certain spots, let's say you're in 4G LTE now, but if you go down to 3G, if you go down to the 1G, you go down to spotted area, that half a second can increase to 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds. So, and a lot of the people from Marriott on the mobile device, we have 80% of our users are booking same day in that same location. So they're either delayed at an airport or they have to extend their stay. They're trying to do this as quickly as possible. So that half a second at performance testing could actually blow out into a full-blown 30 seconds later on, depending on the situation and environment. Go to the next screen over here. So how can we as UX influence all that stuff, all that data that we normally don't have access to, we normally don't have it? Is to review the functional design documentation. Now that's usually dry stuff. It's very dry. It's about usually 300 to 400, 600 pages of dryness in there. It's just code after code after code and charts of pictures of what's important. But there's only things that you need to focus on. You don't need to learn how to write any of this stuff like in the XML or the JSON. You just need to know how to read it, and it's simple enough to read. But what you want to do is look at the request parameters. Look at what's required and what's optional. All your user stories, all your scenarios are dictated by your required and optional. So when you tell your developers, this is a scenario, this is a user story, in their minds they're thinking, which call am I doing? Which web service call are you doing? And what information are you passing to me? So every single one of your scenarios is based on those your parameters sending in. And then focus on the response of what's coming back. Is it what you need, or is it a whole bunch of stuff that you don't need at the point in time? If you can catch it early enough in the time of the API design, you can have them work on, like I said before, of pre-selecting what you want to show back with. Luckily, what we were able to do is they have included an expand capability in the API response. So you can provide the whole listing and not expand anything at all. Let's say a whole list of the saved properties, and it doesn't expand anything. That means it doesn't go out and individually grab all the data for every single property. What it'll do instead is just give you that one initial list, and that's it, and it'll stop right there. If someone taps on a particular property, then it'll go out and get it. So you save on a lot of that data coming through to build that initial list. And then walk through your tech development team of the scenarios that you have and what you're actually expecting. And I'll show you a documentation that we constructed for them for that. So this is an example of that. This initial API request from Twitter. So it shows you the ID is a required ID, and this ID right here is required in this particular API request. Everything else is optional. So from there, you can know what you can request. So they're all optional pieces. So for this one, in particular for Twitter, it'll show you, let's say, the retweets, if you wanted to show that. It'll show you the favorites, or I think whatever it was, the users and information that come back. So you don't have to. If you want to get that piece of information, that'll come back. So that's the optional piece of it. And Marriott was able to instigate some of this as well, but also that's how we defined what our scenarios were through all the parameters. And let me walk into that in a little bit here. So this is the documentation that we constructed for the tech team. So it's not pretty. It is basically a bunch of columns. And basically this first column over here identifies the particular scenario. So I know, unless you have fantastic image, because I can't even read it right here. So basically it's like location search for a member with no special rates. That's one scenario. Second scenario is location search for a member with special rates. And on and on and on with all these error scenarios put in. These is the request parameters. So these are the parameters that we will be sending in, because that ties into that particular scenario. On some of them, there's no special rates because that's not in the scenario. On those that do. This also includes the faulty errors. So if you have alternate paths or you have error paths, that's what you include in as individual down scenarios. So this is, I think this document was about 600 lines long, or 600 rows long, because those are all the things that we gave them so that they can make sure. And these were not, this wasn't everything. This was the main important pieces, the main scenarios that we want to make sure that the majority of our users can finish with. This column over here identified the actual API services or web services that we expected to call in order to initiate this scenario over here. And this is the important piece, is our our expected response. So you don't have to go through and write, like I said, you don't have to go through and write all the XML or JSON response, but you tell them what you're expecting. I expect a full refresh with only this new list of hotels sorted by this type. That's what you get back. Or, yeah.
And you had the content model, like for the second column before you started this document?
Right, yes. Yeah, so that's one of the things that we had to create beforehand, but this is essentially just a little wrap up just for those guys. Okay, and then basically what it also tells you is, you see here where it says error, well, sometimes we don't have all the full error code, but we now provide the proper messaging we should get back from the system as well. So that's what we're trying to do over here, is to friendly up all that thing instead of just going, okay, it's a catch-22, everything shoves into a 503 or a 500. And then the last one are just notes. For example, here's an error, but it needs to be in language, because Marriott services multiple languages. So this is a very important piece of documentation that the testers needed. So next slide. So I went through real quick the data and performance, but one of the things that you need to go through next from here, if you want to take this to the next step, is to talk to your tech team and try to get your setup on your machines the same way as your testers, not the dev, but your testers, because those are the ones that once they are finished development, they'll drop into test, and you are using their same like tools, for example, SOAP UI or Postman, to access that data and find out if it's what you need. And then you can immediately come back to them and say, this needs to be tweaked. Next thing is have them walk you through everything the first time.
So in that last page, were you assuming that the APIs have already been created, or is this like if you were going to create them?
Both. So that could be at either time, yeah. So that list, that sheet when I initially created it, the API was still being designed. And then even as I was still creating, they started development on it anyway. But I handed that up.
Deciding what kind of parameters and everything.
Right,
you
yeah.
want the APIs, okay.
And then just listen to what they're talking about. And like I said, look at the tech document. It's really boring and it's really dry, but there's a lot of information in there. Because like I said, the focus is what's required, what's optional for the request and the response. Those are the two biggest pieces of information that you want to look into. And then just talk to them about why you're doing this, because you don't imagine, when I talked to our tech and dev team, they were so happy that a UX front-end person would be willing to even go and find out what they were doing. So once I asked them for this, they just kind of threw up every access to everything for me, and I'm like, well, okay, well, thanks, but I don't know how to use any of it, but they gave me all that access. So if you just talk to them, they will give you a lot of it, because they'll be happy that someone from our side of things will want to see because a lot of times they get dumped on from all the things that we design everything. Everyone goes through testing, everyone goes through all that, and it's fantastic. And then it gets built out, and it's like, that's not what we expected. So.
To what extent are you getting the client's DBAs involved?
So they are pretty, depending on, so on various different projects that we've worked on, the DBAs are usually heavily involved because they are able to, they all have all the data into it. But at Marriott, where they have multiple systems for every single thing, we had to pull in all the database administrators. So we were sitting in a room of like 20, 30 people because there's so much data. But that data can potentially not ever change because it's so old or so hard to get into. I think at Marriott, it takes a year to change one line of data in the database and like $1 million. So essentially, we had to prioritize all the things that we wanted that were the most important, and then stage that into their development cycle. Because no matter our UX cycle of producing something, almost never matches their development cycle of improving their system. So.
It's also important to be able to, from a UX perspective, be able to ask for something from the back end. Don't ask for stuff that you know you're not going to get. Like you had an example where you had a list of items and each one had an image. And you can ask for like all the images at once with one API call. It's not going to happen.
Right.
You're going to have to, depending on how long the list is, then you're going to have to design your UI to be able to kind of dynamically load that list and then load those images on demand as well.
Yep. So I mean, that's one of the things where when we initially design things, we assume one particular method of doing it. But when you talk to the tech group and you talk to the development group, you might have to do some tweaking for the initial current version 1 release or the version 2 initial. You can talk to them about how you want things to happen in the future, but the initial part, Gesundheit, will usually not fit with the way you initially designed that UI. So that's the way it goes. So thank you very much. If you have any other questions, I'll be packing up. So thanks a lot.